The polished marble floors of the courthouse gleamed under the recessed lighting, reflecting the cold, impassive faces of lawyers and the anxious energy of their clients. But no one's anxiety vibrated with the same raw public intensity as Amelia's. 6 months pregnant, her belly a taut drum. Beneath a bespoke Dior maternity dress, she stood beside her lawyer, a woman whose calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the storm brewing. Across the aisle, her husband, the billionaire industrialist Julian Croft, smirked, flanked by a team of legal sharks. He'd brought her here to discard her, to label her an unfaithful wife, and cast her out before their child could be born. But what Julian didn't know, what the clicking tongues of the press and the stern-faced judge were about to discover, was that Amelia's lawyer, a quiet force of nature named Ms. Albright, was holding a single, unassuming file. A file that wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration of war. A file that would unravel a dynasty, expose a web of deceit, and prove that in the rarefied world of the ultra-rich, the most shocking secrets are the ones you think are buried deepest. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise," but all Amelia could hear was the frantic, desperate beating of her own heart. The show was about to begin. The story of Julian and Amelia Croft was on the surface a modern fairy tale. He was the titan of industry, the charismatic billionaire whose company, Ethelred Energy, was at the forefront of the green technology revolution. His face, a handsome and chiseled mask of confidence, was a regular feature in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. Julian Croft wasn't just a businessman. He was a brand, a symbol of audacious success and ruthless efficiency. Amelia, on the other hand, was the soft-focused dream that completed the picture. A former art curator, with a gentle smile and an ethereal grace, she was the perfect counterpart to his steely ambition. They had met at a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a whirlwind romance that culminated in a lavish wedding on the Amalfi Coast. For 2 years, their life was a carefully curated montage of perfection, sun-drenched holidays on their super yacht, the Serafina, philanthropic endeavors that earned them fawning press, and a sprawling Fifth Avenue penthouse with panoramic views of Central Park. To the outside world, they were impenetrable, a fortress of wealth and love. But within the opulent walls of their gilded cage, the fairy tale had begun to curdle. Julian, a man who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, was a different beast in private. His affection was a currency he dispensed and withheld with calculated precision. His compliments were often backhanded, his praise a prelude to a demand. He was a master of the subtle art of emotional erosion, chipping away at Amelia's confidence until she felt like another one of his prized possessions, beautiful and silent. The pregnancy had, at first, seemed like a potential bridge over the chasm that had opened between them. Amelia had hoped a child would soften him, would anchor him to the family he so often treated as a subsidiary of his corporate empire. For a while, it seemed to work. Julian was publicly ecstatic, the doting father-to-be, his hand always possessively on Amelia's growing belly for the paparazzi. He commissioned a nursery that cost more than a suburban home, complete with a hand-painted mural of the cosmos and a crib carved from a single piece of rare, sustainable wood. But the performance was all for the public. In private, the pregnancy became another tool of control. He dictated her diet, her social circle, even the prenatal yoga classes she attended, all under the guise of concern for his heir. The word heir was always spoken with a chilling emphasis, a reminder that the child in his eyes was not a product of their love, but a continuation of his legacy. The first crack in the facade appeared 3 months into the pregnancy. Julian had been on a business trip to Singapore. Amelia, feeling unusually unwell, had visited a different obstetrician than the one Julian's health concierge had handpicked for her. It was a small act of rebellion, a desperate attempt to reclaim some agency over her own body. The visit was routine, but something the doctor said, a casual, off-the-cuff remark about the timing of her conception, planted a seed of unease in Amelia's mind. It was a tiny discrepancy, a matter of a few days, but it was a loose thread in the tightly woven narrative of her life. When Julian returned, she had casually mentioned the visit. His reaction was anything but casual. A cold, dangerous fury had flashed in his eyes, a look she had only seen once before, when a junior executive had dared to question his judgment in a board meeting. He had accused her of being reckless, of endangering the baby, of undermining his authority. The argument had escalated, his voice a low, menacing growl that filled the cavernous penthouse. He had called her foolish, naive, and for the first time, the word untrustworthy had slithered into the opulent air between them. The final, irreparable shatter came a month later. It was a Tuesday. Amelia remembered the day with a chilling clarity. The sky over Manhattan was a brilliant, cloudless blue. She had been organizing the baby's clothes, the tiny, soft garments, a stark contrast to the cold dread that had taken root in her heart. Julian had come home early. He didn't kiss her hello. He didn't ask about her day. He simply stood in the doorway of the nursery, his face a granite mask, and said, "We're done." He had thrown a sheaf of papers onto the antique table beside her. They were grainy, black and white photographs, photos of her 2 weeks prior having lunch with a male friend, a former colleague from her museum days. The photos were taken from a distance innocuous, but Julian had twisted them into a narrative of infidelity. He claimed to have a private investigator's report, a damning document that proved her betrayal. He spoke of her indiscretions, her deceit, and the ultimate unforgivable sin, the possibility that the child she was carrying was not his. Amelia was stunned into silence. The accusation was so ludicrous, so patently false, that she couldn't even begin to formulate a defense. It was a lie, a monstrous, life-altering lie, and he was wielding it with the calm, practiced ease of a man who had planned this for a very long time. That's when he had told her about the divorce. He would be generous, he'd said, his voice dripping with condescending magnanimity. A clean break, a settlement that would see her live comfortably but out of the public eye. All she had to do was sign the papers, agree to his terms, and disappear. The alternative, he had warned, his voice dropping to a whisper, was public humiliation. He would contest the paternity of the child, drag her name through the mud, and ensure she was left with nothing. For a week, Amelia had existed in a state of suspended shock. The man she had loved, the father of her unborn child, was a stranger, a monster in a bespoke suit. She had been on the verge of succumbing, of signing away her life to escape the nightmare. But then something shifted. A primal protective instinct for the child, growing inside her, ignited a fire she thought had long been extinguished. She would not let her child be born into a world where their father had branded their mother a liar and a cheat. She would not be erased. She had remembered a name whispered to her months ago by a friend who had gone through a contentious divorce, a lawyer who specialized in high-stakes, high-conflict cases, a woman who was known for her discretion, her tenacity, and her uncanny ability to unearth the truth. Her name was Ms. Albright. Their first meeting had taken place in a discreet, anonymous office in a midtown skyscraper, a world away from the opulent splendor of Amelia's penthouse. Amelia had recounted her story, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as she laid bare the private hell of her marriage. Ms. Albright had listened, her expression unreadable, her pen gliding silently across a legal pad. She had asked few questions, but the ones she did were sharp, precise, and aimed at the heart of the matter. "Mr. Croft is a man who likes to control the narrative," Ms. Albright had said at the end of their meeting, her voice calm and measured. "Our job is to present a different narrative, the true one." In the weeks that followed, Miss Albright and her team had worked with a quiet, relentless efficiency. They had delved into Julian Croft's life, his business dealings, his past. They had spoken to former employees, disgruntled associates, and people who had long since been cast out of Julian's orbit. And slowly, piece by painstaking piece, a new picture had begun to emerge. A picture that was far darker, far more complex than Amelia could ever have imagined. Now standing in the sterile, intimidating environment of the family court, Amelia clutched Ms. Albright's arm, her knuckles white. The air crackled with anticipation. The press, packed into the gallery like vultures, were scribbling furiously. Julian, across the aisle, looked supremely confident, a predator who had his prey exactly where he wanted it. He caught her eye and gave her a small, contemptuous smile, a smile that said, "You are nothing. You are about to be destroyed." But as the judge took his seat and the proceedings began, Amelia looked at Miss Albright. The lawyer met her gaze, and for the first time, Amelia saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not pity, not sympathy, but the cold, hard glint of a warrior about to enter the fray. Miss Albright gave a barely perceptible nod, her hand resting on the simple, unassuming manila file on the table in front of them. The file that held the truth. The file that was about to change everything. "We are here today," began Julian's lead counsel, a silver-haired shark named Marcus Thorne, his voice resonating with practiced gravitas, to address the unfortunate and deeply regrettable dissolution of the marriage between Mr. Julian Croft and Ms. Amelia Croft, niece Sterling. A marriage my client entered into with the utmost faith and devotion. Thorne paced before the judge, a picture of righteous indignation. "Mr. Croft is a man of considerable public standing, a pillar of the business community, and a philanthropist of great renown. His reputation is built on a foundation of integrity and trust. It is with a heavy heart, therefore, that we must bring to this court's attention a matter of profound personal betrayal." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the silent courtroom. Julian, at the plaintiff's table, bowed his head slightly, the very image of a wronged man. "My client, Your Honor," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, "has reason to believe, based on irrefutable evidence, that the child Ms. Croft is carrying is not his, that he has been the victim of a calculated and cruel deception." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The reporters' pens flew across their notepads. Amelia felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up her neck. It was one thing to hear the accusation in the cold, sterile confines of her penthouse. It was another to have it broadcast in a public courtroom, to have her integrity, her very being as a mother, questioned before the world. Thorne, sensing the drama, pressed his advantage. "We have submitted as evidence a report from a licensed private investigator. This report details Ms. Croft's clandestine meetings with another man. It paints a picture not of a devoted, expectant mother, but of a woman engaged in an illicit affair." He gestured towards the file. His team had submitted a thick, professionally bound document that sat menacingly on the clerk's desk. Furthermore, we have sworn affidavits from staff members at the Croft residence attesting to Ms. Croft's increasingly secretive behavior, her unexplained absences, her emotional distance. It was a masterclass in character assassination, a tapestry of half-truths and outright lies woven together to create a compelling, if entirely fictional, narrative. The clandestine meetings were the two lunches with her friend. The secretive behavior was her desperate attempts to find a moment of peace away from Julian's controlling presence. The emotional distance was the chasm he himself had carved between them. "Mr. Croft is not a vindictive man," Thorne said, his tone softening to one of feigned magnanimity. "He wishes Ms. Croft no ill will. He is prepared to offer a generous settlement, one that will allow her to live a comfortable life. He asks for only one thing in return: a clean break, a dissolution of this unfortunate union, and a legal acknowledgement that he is not the biological father of the child." He finished his opening statement and returned to his seat, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He had painted Amelia as a gold-digging adulteress, and Julian as the magnanimous, heartbroken victim. In the court of public opinion, the first blow had been a powerful one. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense man named Judge Harrison, turned his gaze to the defense table. "Ms. Albright," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your response." Ms. Albright rose slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. She was a stark contrast to the theatrical Thorne. She wore a simple, dark grey suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She exuded an aura of quiet, unshakable competence. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, betraying no hint of the drama that had just unfolded. "My client, Ms. Amelia Croft, categorically denies all of Mr. Thorne's allegations. She is and has always been a faithful and devoted wife. The child she is carrying is without a shadow of a doubt her husband's." She didn't pace, she didn't raise her voice. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed on the judge. "Mr. Thorne speaks of irrefutable evidence." She continued, a faint, almost imperceptible note of irony in her voice. "He speaks of a private investigator's report. He speaks of affidavits from staff. What he presents is not evidence, Your Honor. It is a narrative, a story crafted by a very wealthy and very powerful man who is used to getting his own way. A man who, when faced with a situation he cannot control, resorts to bullying and fabrication." Julian's jaw tightened. Thorne looked poised to object, but Ms. Albright gave him no opening. "My client is not a gold digger. She is not an adulteress. She is a woman who has been subjected to a campaign of emotional abuse and control, culminating in this public spectacle. A spectacle designed to intimidate her, to shame her into silence, and to sever her from her unborn child." She paused, letting her own words settle in the room. The narrative she was painting was a stark counterpoint to Thorne's story of a vulnerable woman being crushed by an all-powerful man. "Mr. Croft is seeking to dissolve this marriage," Ms. Albright said. "On that, we are in agreement. This marriage is for all intents and purposes over. It was over long before we set foot in this courtroom. But we are not here to debate the terms of a settlement based on a foundation of lies. We are here to uncover the truth." She then did something unexpected. She turned her gaze from the judge and looked directly at Julian Croft. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "Mr. Croft, you claim the child my client is carrying is not yours. You have based this entire proceeding on that single, monstrous accusation. Are you prepared to stand by that accusation, Mr. Croft?" Under oath, the question, direct and piercing, hung in the air. Julian, for the first time, looked momentarily flustered. He exchanged a quick, nervous glance with Thorne. "My client has made his position clear through his counsel," Thorne interjected, rising to his feet. "I am asking your client, Mr. Thorne," Ms. Albright said, her voice still quiet, but now laced with steel. "Is he Julian Croft, willing to state under penalty of perjury that he believes he is not the father of his wife's child?" Eyes in the courtroom were now on Julian. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He was a man accustomed to having others speak for him, to having his will enacted through proxies. He was not used to being challenged so directly, so publicly. He cleared his throat. I have every reason to believe that is the case," he said, his voice a little hoarse. It was not the booming, confident declaration one might have expected. It was the hesitant, slightly defensive response of a man on the back foot. Miss Albright gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if he had just confirmed something for her. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, turning back to the judge. "We have no further response at this time. However, we do have a piece of evidence we would like to submit to the court. A single file that we believe will shed a great deal of light on the veracity of Mr. Croft's claims." She walked back to her table and picked up the unassuming manila file. It looked thin, almost insignificant, compared to the thick, professionally bound report submitted by Julian's team. She handed it to the court clerk, who in turn passed it up to Judge Harrison. The judge took the file. He glanced at Julian's table, then back at Ms. Albright. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the room. What could be in that single, slender file that could possibly counter the mountain of evidence Julian's team had presented? Julian, trying to regain his composure, leaned over to Thorne and whispered something, a dismissive smirk returning to his lips. He was clearly unconcerned. What could they possibly have? A few character witnesses? A diary full of self-serving entries? It was nothing. He had the money, the power, the best lawyers. He had already won. Judge Harrison opened the file. His expression, which had been one of stern impassivity, shifted. He read the first page, then the second. His eyebrows, which had been furrowed in concentration, now rose in surprise. He looked up from the file, his eyes locking onto Julian Croft. The look on the judge's face was no longer one of simple judicial curiosity. It was one of profound, unadulterated shock. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the faint, frantic scratching of reporters' pens. Amelia's heart was pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was in that file. Ms. Albright had only told her that it was their ace in the hole. The judge read, and his expression hardening with each turn of the page. The silence in the courtroom stretched, becoming taut and heavy. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom before landing with the force of a physical blow on Julian Croft. "Mr. Croft," the judge said, his voice now dangerously quiet. "Would you care to explain this?" He held up a single piece of paper from the file. From the gallery, it was impossible to see what it was. But Julian Croft saw it, and the color drained from his face. The confident smirk, the arrogant posture, the aura of untouchable power, it all dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. His carefully constructed world, his meticulously crafted narrative, was about to come crashing down. The contents of that single shocking file were about to be revealed. The document Judge Harrison held aloft was not a photograph, not a letter, not a sworn affidavit from a disgruntled employee. It was a medical report. Specifically, a fertility analysis report for one Mr. Julian Croft, dated 18 months prior. The letterhead was from a prestigious and discreet private clinic in Zurich, Switzerland. Mr. Croft Judge Harrison repeated, his voice now imbued with a cold authority that cut through the tense silence. This report from the Kleist Clinic in Zurich states that you, due to a severe and irreversible case of azoospermia, are biologically incapable of fathering a child. It states in no uncertain terms that your chances of natural conception are, and I quote, statistically zero. Would you care to explain how a man with a statistically zero chance of fathering a child is now claiming to be the victim of a paternity dispute? The courtroom erupted. The hushed whispers and frantic scribbling of the press exploded into a cacophony of audible gasps and frantic shouted questions. The bailiff banged his gavel, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a teacup. Julian Croft was frozen in his chair, his face a ghastly shade of white. He looked at the document in the judge's hand, then at his lawyer, Marcus Thorne, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and desperation. Thorne himself was blindsided, his mouth agape, his carefully prepared legal strategy in tatters. He had built his entire case on the premise of Amelia's infidelity, on the question of the child's paternity. But how can you contest the paternity of a child you could never have fathered in the first place? Amelia felt the floor drop out from beneath her. A wave of nausea, unrelated to her pregnancy, washed over her. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind reeling. Julian was sterile. He had known for at least 18 months that he could never have a biological child. The pieces of the puzzle, the seemingly disconnected moments of the past year, began to click into place with a sickening, horrifying clarity. His obsession with an heir, his insistence on controlling every aspect of her pregnancy, his strange, furious reaction to her visiting a different doctor, the casual remark from that doctor about the timing of her conception, it all made a terrible, twisted kind of sense. Your Honor, Thorne stammered, finally finding his voice, though it was strained and uncertain. We contest the authenticity of this document. We have had no time to review this alleged evidence. It is a fabrication, a desperate last-ditch attempt to slander my client, Ms. Albright, rose once more, her demeanor as serene as ever. Your Honor, the file contains not only the original report from the Kleist Clinic, but also a notarized affidavit from Dr. Anja Schmidt, the head of the clinic, confirming its authenticity. Furthermore, it includes the wire transfer receipts for the payment of the clinic's services sent from a private offshore account belonging to Mr. Croft, an account, I might add, that does not appear on the list of assets he submitted to this court during the initial financial disclosure. Another bombshell. Not only had Julian lied about his fertility, but he was also hiding assets. The case was no longer just about a divorce. It was about perjury, contempt of court, and financial fraud. The judge's gaze was glacial. He looked at Julian, who seemed to be shrinking in his expensive suit. Mr. Croft, is this true? Did you withhold financial information from this court? Julian didn't answer. He just stared at Amelia, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that chilled her to the bone. It was the look of a king whose crown had been snatched from his head, of a god whose mortality had just been exposed to the world. But if he can't, Amelia whispered, turning to Ms. Albright, her mind still struggling to process the full implications. Then, how? The unspoken question hung between them. How was she pregnant? Ms. Albright's calm expression finally softened with a flicker of empathy. She leaned in closer, her voice a low, steady anchor in Amelia's swirling vortex of confusion. Amelia, we need to talk about the fertility clinic you and Julian attended here in New York, the one he chose. the one run by Dr. Adrian Vale. The name struck a discordant note in Amelia's memory. Dr. Vale, the suave, reassuring doctor who had overseen their IVF treatments. Julian had insisted on him citing his unparalleled reputation and cutting-edge techniques. He had been a constant, calming presence throughout the process, his bedside manner impeccable, his reassurances absolute. What about him? Amelia asked, a new, cold dread beginning to form in the pit of her stomach. Dr. Vale, Ms. Albright, said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, is a very old, very dear friend of your husband's. They attended boarding school together in Switzerland, the same town, incidentally, where the Kleist Clinic is located. The connection was tenuous, circumstantial, but in the context of the day's revelations, it felt like a lit fuse burning towards a powder keg. The judge, having restored some semblance of order to the courtroom, was now looking at the file with renewed intensity. He had moved past the medical report and was now examining a new set of documents. His expression, if possible, grew even more thunderous. Ms. Albright, he said, his voice grave, the file also contains a donor agreement from the very same New York fertility clinic. An anonymous donor. He paused, looking directly at Amelia, his stern facade softening for a moment with something that looked almost like pity, and a sworn statement from a nurse at that clinic, a statement alleging that on the day of your embryo transfer, there was a last-minute undocumented substitution of the donor sample. The world went silent. The noise of the courtroom, the frantic whispers of the press, the pounding of her own heart, it all faded away. There was only the judge's voice echoing in the vast, empty space that had just opened up inside her. A substitution. The child inside her, the life she had nurtured and loved, the baby she believed was a product of her and Julian's last desperate attempt to build a family, was not Julian's. That much was now a certainty. But if the donor sample had been swapped, then who was the father? She looked at Julian. His face was no longer a mask of rage, but of cold, calculating fury. He had been exposed, his deepest, most humiliating secret laid bare, but there was something else in his eyes now, a flicker of triumph, a glint of dark, twisted victory. And then Amelia understood. The full monstrous scope of his plan crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. This was never about a divorce, it was about control. It was about legacy. He couldn't have his own biological child, so he had orchestrated the creation of one. He had chosen the donor, a man whose identity was a mystery, and had him secretly inseminate her. He had let her believe the child was his, basked in the public adoration of the doting father-to-be, all the while knowing the truth. And the divorce, the accusations of infidelity, they were the final, brilliant, evil masterstroke. He would publicly accuse her of cheating, use the paternity of the child as his weapon. He would force a DNA test, which would, of course, prove the child wasn't his. He would win. He would be seen as the victim, the cuckolded husband. He would get to keep the child, his heir, untainted by a mother he had successfully painted as an adulteress. He would raise the child as his own, the product of an anonymous donor. His legacy secured, his secret shame buried forever. It was a plan of breathtaking cruelty, a web of deceit so intricate and so evil that Amelia could barely comprehend it. She had not been a wife. She had been an incubator, a vessel for his ambition. Her legs gave way, and she would have collapsed had Ms. Albright not been there to steady her. The lawyer's hand was a firm, reassuring presence on her arm. "Your Honor," Ms. Albright said, her voice ringing with a righteous fury that she had until now kept carefully concealed. It is now clear what has happened here. Mr. Croft, unable to father his own child, has perpetrated a monstrous fraud upon his wife and this court. He has used a fertility clinic to impregnate his wife with a stranger's DNA, all with the intention of later discrediting her, divorcing her, and seizing sole custody of the child. This is not a divorce proceeding, Your Honor. This is a crime scene. Thorne was on his feet, protesting, but his words were drowned out by the judge's gavel, which now fell with the finality of a death sentence. Mr. Croft, Judge Harrison boomed, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office. Your assets are hereby frozen. You will surrender your passport to this court by the end of the day, and you will have no contact, direct or indirect, with Ms. Croft or the unborn child. Bailiffs, escort Mr. Croft from my courtroom. Two burly bailiffs moved towards Julian. The billionaire who had walked into the courtroom that morning, a king, was now a common criminal. He looked at Amelia one last time, his eyes promising a retribution that went far beyond the confines of a courtroom. Then he was gone. The courtroom was in chaos. The press was in a frenzy. But Amelia saw none of it. She was looking at the file that still lay on the judge's bench, the file that had saved her, the file that had exposed the truth. But as the initial shock began to subside, a new terrifying question began to form in her mind, a question that Miss Albright's next words would bring into sharp, horrifying focus. Amelia, the lawyer, said, her voice gentle but firm. We need to find out who the donor was. We need to find out who the father of your child is. The baby inside her kicked a small, innocent flutter, oblivious to the storm that had just broken around it. A storm that was far from over, because the identity of the anonymous donor, the secret Julian had thought was buried forever, was about to become the next and most explosive revelation in the fall of the House of Croft. The days that followed the courtroom bombshell were a blur of headlines, legal meetings, and a suffocating, all-encompassing media frenzy. Croft's cruel conspiracy screamed the cover of the New York Post. Billionaire's baby plot exposed, declared the Daily Mail. The story was a global sensation, a lurid tale of wealth deceit and unimaginable betrayal. Julian Croft, the titan of industry, was now a pariah holed up in his penthouse, his assets frozen, his empire in freefall as stocks in Ethelred Energy plummeted. For Amelia, the victory in court felt hollow. The public humiliation of Julian was a cold comfort when her own life had been so spectacularly detonated. She was living in a secure, undisclosed location, a luxury hotel suite, paid for by a fund Ms. Albright had established. But the gilded cage had simply been replaced by a different kind of prison one, with bodyguards in the lobby and a constant gnawing anxiety in her heart. The central terrifying question remained, who was the father of her child? Ms. Albright and her team had filed an emergency petition to unseal the records of the fertility clinic. Dr. Adrian Vale, the suave doctor who had been Julian's accomplice, had been suspended his practice under investigation. But the clinic's records were a fortress of legal and medical confidentiality. Unsealing them would be a battle. They're fighting us at every turn, Ms. Albright explained, during one of their daily meetings in the sterile hotel suite. They're citing donor privacy laws, patient confidentiality. Vale and Croft's lawyers are trying to bury this, to bog us down in litigation until the trail goes cold. But there has to be a record, Amelia insisted, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. The baby was more active now, a constant reassuring presence in the midst of the chaos. Someone knows who he is. We believe so. Ms. Albright said, her expression grim. The nurse who gave us the sworn statement, the one who witnessed the sample being swapped, she's gone. Resigned the day after the hearing, and her neighbors say she packed up and left in the middle of the night. We think she was paid off, or worse, intimidated. The web of Julian's influence was vast and terrifying. He may have been cornered, but he was far from powerless. It was during a late-night sleepless scroll through the endless news articles about her own life that Amelia found the first loose thread. It was a detail in a deep-dive investigative piece by a journalist from ProPublica, a non-profit organization known for its meticulous in-depth reporting. The article was a forensic examination of Julian's business dealings, his ruthless rise to the top of Ethelred Energy. It mentioned a name that was at first insignificant: Daniel Petrova. Petrova had been Julian's first real business partner, a brilliant but volatile software engineer who had co-founded the company that would eventually become Ethelred Energy. The article described him as the ghost in the machine, the architect of the proprietary software that had given the company its initial edge. But Petrova had been pushed out of the company years ago in a hostile takeover orchestrated by Julian. The official story was that Petrova had become erratic, a liability. He had sued for wrongful termination, but the case had been settled out of court, with Petrova signing a non-disclosure agreement and disappearing from the tech world. The name stuck with Amelia. Daniel Petrova. There was a photo accompanying the article, a grainy black-and-white image from a decade ago. A young man with dark, intense eyes and a brooding expression standing next to a beaming, triumphant Julian Croft. On a hunch, she forwarded the article to Ms. Albright. This might be nothing she wrote in the email, but something about this feels important. The next day, Ms. Albright arrived at the hotel with a new sense of urgency. Her team had started digging into Daniel Petrova. "We're hitting the same walls we did with the donor records," the lawyer said, pacing the room. "The NDA he signed is ironclad. His legal settlement is sealed. After he left Ethelred, he seems to have fallen off the face of the earth. No social media, no public records, nothing." Julian erased him. Amelia said the words, tasting like ash. It was what Julian did. He erased people who were no longer useful to him. "But we found something," Ms. Albright continued, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "Your husband has a very specific, very expensive hobby. He collects rare books, first editions, signed copies. His collection is insured for over $50 million. Amelia nodded. She knew the collection well. It was housed in a climate-controlled library in their penthouse, a room she had rarely been allowed to enter. His prized possession, Ms. Albright said, is a first edition of Isaac Newton's Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. It's one of the rarest, most valuable scientific texts in the world. He bought it at a private auction 5 years ago for a staggering sum." "What does this have to do with Daniel Petrova?" Amelia asked, confused. "The auction was held in Geneva," Ms. Albright explained. "The underbidder, the person who almost outbid your husband for the book, was an anonymous buyer bidding through a proxy. We managed to track down the art dealer who was acting as the proxy. After a lot of persuasion, he gave us the name of his client." She paused, letting the suspense build. It was Daniel Petrova. The connection was bizarre, almost surreal. A disgraced tech genius and a reclusive billionaire locked in a bidding war over a 17th-century book. "It gets stranger," Ms. Albright said. Petrova wasn't just a software engineer. His university degree wasn't in computer science. It was in theoretical physics and mathematics. He was obsessed with Newton, with the fundamental laws of the universe. The software he designed for Ethelred was based on complex predictive algorithms modeled on chaos theory. It was his genius, not Julian's business acumen, that made that company. A picture began to form in Amelia's mind. A picture of a brilliant, intense man, betrayed by his partner, stripped of his life's work, and then vanishing into obscurity, his only trace a ghostly presence in a high-stakes auction. We think Julian's obsession with this man goes beyond a simple business dispute, Ms. Albright theorized. We think it's a rivalry, a deep-seated jealousy. Julian has the money, the power, the public acclaim. But Petrova has the one thing Julian could never have, true innate genius. Julian bought Ethelred, but Petrova created it. And Julian has spent the last decade trying to erase that fact, to rewrite history. The lawyer's theory was compelling, but it still didn't answer the most pressing question. But why would Julian choose him? Amelia asked, her voice a whisper. As the donor, why would he secretly use the DNA of the man he hates most in the world, Ms. Albright stopped pacing and looked at Amelia, her expression a mixture of awe and revulsion at the depths of Julian's psychological depravity. Because it's the ultimate act of possession, she said, the ultimate revenge. He takes the one thing that is uniquely Petrova's, his genetic code, his legacy, and he steals it. He raises Petrova's biological child as his own, under his name, under his control. He possesses the son of his rival, turning him into a Croft. It's a victory so complete, so twisted, it's almost poetic. It's a plan worthy of a Roman emperor. The sheer diabolical arrogance of it was breathtaking. Julian hadn't just wanted an heir. He had wanted a specific heir. The heir of the man whose intellect he secretly coveted and whose existence he publicly denied. We need to find him, Amelia said, a new resolve hardening her voice. We need to find Daniel Petrova. Finding a ghost, however, was easier said than done. He was a man who had spent a decade perfecting the art of being invisible. But Ms. Albright's team had a new lead. The art dealer who had acted as Petrova's proxy at the auction had, after further persuasion, remembered one more detail. Petrova had a sister, a younger sister who worked as a conservator at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. Miss Albright booked a flight to LA. While her lawyer was chasing down the ghost of Daniel Petrova, Amelia was left alone with her thoughts and with the child that was growing more real, more present with each passing day. The child was no longer an abstract concept, a symbol of her and Julian's fractured marriage. It was a person with a history, a genetic legacy that was a complete mystery to her. A week later, Ms. Albright returned. She walked into the hotel suite, and Amelia knew from the look on her face that something had changed. I found him, the lawyer said, her voice tired but triumphant. Or rather, his sister led me to him. It wasn't easy. She's fiercely protective of him. But when I explained the situation, when I told her about you and about the child, she agreed to talk to him. Amelia held her breath. And he's agreed to meet. He lives a very quiet life, off the grid, in a remote part of Northern California. He's hesitant. He's afraid of Julian. But he wants to know the truth. A meeting was arranged. A neutral location, a private airfield in a secluded valley, far from the prying eyes of the press. Amelia was terrified. What would she say to this man, this stranger who was the biological father of her child? What would he be like? Would he be angry? Would he want to be involved? Would he want nothing to do with them? As she boarded the private jet that would take her to California, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished chrome of the cabin. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She was no longer just the wronged wife of a disgraced billionaire. She was a mother about to meet the other half of her child's story. The ghost was about to step out of the machine, and Amelia had no idea if he would be a savior or another more dangerous kind of storm. The private jet descended into a valley cradled by redwood-dotted mountains. The airfield was a mere strip of asphalt in the wilderness, a gateway to a world far from Manhattan. A black SUV waited, driven by Daniel Petrova's sister, Sophia. Her intense, dark eyes, so like her brother's, were filled with a fierce, wary protectiveness. The silent drive snaked through dense forests and along coastal roads where the Pacific crashed against jagged cliffs. Turning onto an unmarked dirt road, they arrived at a simple modern house of glass and weathered wood perched on a bluff overlooking the ocean. It was a fortress of solitude designed to disappear into the raw, untamed landscape. He was waiting on the deck. Daniel Petrova was no longer the brooding young man from the old photograph. The intensity remained etched into the lines around his eyes, but it was now tempered by a quiet, monastic calm. He was lean, dressed in simple clothes, his dark hair shorter and flecked with gray at the temples. He didn't offer a handshake. He just watched her approach, his gaze, analytical, searching, as if trying to understand the structure of a complex and unexpected problem. "Ms. Croft," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Thank you for coming." "Please," she replied, her own voice a near whisper. "Call me Amelia." They sat on the deck, overlooking the vast expanse of the Pacific. Sophia retreated into the house, leaving them alone with the sound of the wind and waves. The silence was heavy with unspoken questions. "He told me you were dead," Daniel said finally, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The statement was so direct, it took Amelia a moment to register. "Who, Julian?" He nodded slowly. "About 5 years ago. I heard it through a reliable back channel. A tragic car accident in Europe. I believed it. It made a certain kind of sense. Julian has always been a man who likes to tie up loose ends." The casual, chilling remark revealed the profound animosity between them. Julian hadn't just pushed him from a company, he had tried to erase his existence. "I'm sorry," Amelia said the words, feeling inadequate. A short, mirthless laugh escaped him. "Don't be. Being dead has been the most productive period of my life." He gestured to the house and the wilderness around them. No board meetings, no quarterly reports, no distractions. He finally turned his full attention to her, his gaze dropping to her pregnant belly. The analytical mask on his face softened, replaced by a look of profound, unreadable complexity. It was confusion, curiosity, and a flicker of something that looked like awe. So he said softly, "It's true." "Yes," she confirmed, her hand instinctively rising to her stomach. "It's all true." Ms. Albright, through Sophia, had already conveyed the broad strokes of the situation, but the abstract horror was nothing compared to this reality. Why, Daniel asked the question, directed more at the universe than at her. Of all the people in the world, why me? "Because he hates you," Amelia said, her voice gaining strength as she repeated Ms. Albright's theory. "Because he's pathologically jealous of you." This was his ultimate way of winning, of owning the one thing you created that he could never steal or buy. Daniel considered this. He didn't steal the company he corrected with a surprising lack of bitterness. I let him have it. I saw where he was going. Ethelred was supposed to be about creating something elegant, an algorithm to predict patterns. He twisted it, turned it into a weapon for corporate raiding. It became ugly, so I walked away. He told the world he fired you for being unstable, Amelia said gently. He told the world the narrative that served him best, Daniel replied. Julian is an architect of realities. He builds intricate cages for other people. It seems he built a particularly cruel one for you. In his eyes, she saw the weary recognition of someone who had also been trapped by Julian's manipulations. In that moment, she felt a strange kinship with this intense, reclusive man. What do you want? He asked, his voice direct but not unkind. From me, he clarified when she hesitated. My name is now tied to yours and this child's. The press and Julian's lawyers will find me. This quiet life is over. So what do you want? Money. I don't have much. Do you want me to disappear again? Deny everything. Amelia looked at him, the stranger who was the other half of her child's story. She thought of the baby inside her who deserved a life free from the poison of Julian's legacy. I want you to take a DNA test, she said, her voice finding a new, unshakable strength. I want you to legally establish your paternity. I want the world to know unequivocally that you are this child's father, not Julian Croft, and not anonymous donor number 7. She took a deep breath. And after that, I don't know. I just want my child to be free. Free of Julian, his lies, and the stain of his name. I want him, or her, to have a chance at an honest life. Daniel was silent for a long time, watching the sun dip towards the horizon. He won't give up, he said, his voice low and certain. You won in court, but that was just a battle. The war isn't over. Julian doesn't lose. He just finds a new angle of attack. He'll try to prove you're an unfit mother. He'll paint me as an unstable recluse. He will use all his power to destroy us both, to get his hands on that child. A cold fear gripped Amelia. She knew he was right. Then we fight him, she said, her voice trembling but laced with a steely resolve. Together. Daniel turned to her, a long, appraising gaze that seemed to see into the core of her determination. A slow, wry smile touched his lips for the first time. It was the smile of a man who had been presented with a complex and fascinating puzzle. Julian's greatest strength, Daniel said, a new dangerous energy in his voice, is that he believes he's the smartest person in any room. His greatest weakness is that his ego, his all-consuming obsession with me, that's a flaw in his code, a systemic vulnerability, and I know exactly how to exploit it. He stood and walked to the edge of the deck, his silhouette framed against the dying sun. He wanted my legacy, Daniel said, his voice carrying on the wind, no longer the quiet recluse, but the confident genius Julian had tried to bury. He's about to get it. You have your lawyer to fight him in court. I will fight him in the world he and I created, the world of shadows and data, of whispers and algorithms. I will show you how to dismantle a man who has no soul. Amelia realized that Julian, in his hubris, had made a fatal miscalculation. He intended to use Daniel as a ghost, a pawn in his twisted game. But he hadn't just awakened a ghost. He had awakened a dragon. The final act was about to begin, not in a courtroom, but in the digital ether where the darkest secrets are buried. And Daniel Petrova, the architect of shadows, knew exactly where to dig. Julian's end came not from a gavel, but from Janus, a code Daniel Petrova unleashed from his solitary fortress. The algorithm didn't steal or crash, it simply unearthed truth. It exposed a decade of Julian's corruption, fraud, blackmail, and the unredacted conspiracy against Amelia and delivered it to federal prosecutors. The Titan was arrested, his empire crumbling as he faced a lifetime in prison. His downfall was absolute. Months later, Amelia welcomed her son, Leo. She found peace far from the city, building a new quiet life. Daniel, having established his paternity, retreated to his coastside haven. He became a guardian to his son, a watchful presence bound to Amelia by their shared history. Their story became a legend of how a mother's courage and an architect of shadows toppled a king, proving that even in a world of absolute power, a single, shocking truth can change everything. If that tale of ultimate revenge and justice had your heart pounding, don't let the drama stop here. Show your support by hitting like and share this video with anyone who loves a story where the mighty fall. Most importantly, subscribe and ring the notification bell because we have more shocking stories you won't want to miss. What was the most satisfying part of Julian's downfall for you? Drop your answer in the comments below and let's discuss.